лучшим откомандотером. Сказки смертников надеть надо на уши, чтоб позабыли, где чужие, а где наши. Выребли Европу, Рейган и Андропов. Выребли Европу с двух сторон. А нахера нам нахуя она? Военная монархия.
Welcome to another informative episode of Actually Existing Socialism, the show where we get to hear from people who live in a socialist country, have lived in a socialist country, or have studied one extensively. This is your host, Tony, and what you just heard is an example of Soviet punk rock by the band known as the Department of Self-Eradication, singing a song about Reagan and Andropov, a song with a story behind it that our guest will later explain for us. In this fascinating episode, Alexander Herbert joins to discuss his book, What About Tomorrow? An Oral History of Russian Punk from the Soviet Era to Pussy Riot. As always on this show, we're covering something new, in the way we're talking today about counterculture music and the late Soviet period. I myself have virtually no understanding of the punk rock genre, so don't think that you need to be a punk rock enthusiast to enjoy this episode, as the topics we cover include Soviet regulation of media, music, and art, how all this ties into the end of the Soviet Union, and much more. Alexander Herbert, who holds a master's in Russian history and a PhD in modern Russia, is an expert in the history of the Soviet Union and global environmental history. His research examines the interrelations of science, technology, and environmental change in the late USSR. Alexander is additionally interested in the interaction of popular culture and education and has published 2 books. The first, which we'll be covering in this episode, on the history of punk rock in the Soviet Union and Russia, and another that uses horror films in the late USSR to examine the anxieties and fears of the late Soviet society. He's also taught classes on the history of capitalism, radical politics in Europe, film history, and underground culture. Alex has an active Substack, is a documentarian, and is currently working on a project called Lenin in 45, all of which are linked in the show notes, and I recommend, if you have time, to check them out. Actually Existing Socialism is a podcast that is 100% listener funded, so if you do wish to contribute as a Patreon subscriber, you'll gain access to a variety of bonus episodes and content. For example, for this episode, you'll gain access to an additional conversation I had with Alex. You can support the show at patreon.com/AESthepodcast. Special shout out to my newest patrons since the last episode. Thank you, Howard Wadeskin, Naomi, Ron Brown, Justin Bearclaw, Dennis and Alice Bartels, Hannah, Homicidal P, Kazadum, Abweichung, Andre D, Balthazar, and Faith Washington. I literally cannot do this show without your support. If you're unable to contribute in this way, that's not a problem. What you can do to help out is share this episode, and by following us on social media at AES the Podcast. You can also subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast platform to get new episode notifications. Feel free to leave a review, if it's even just a star rating, as those really boost the algorithm in my favor. I recommend checking out the extensive back catalog as well when you have the chance. As always, the most important thing you can do to help out the show is by engaging in local worker struggles, whatever that may be. Enjoy the episode.
Рейган и Андропов, выебли Европу с двух сторон. А нахера нам нахуя она? Военная монархия. А нахера нам нахуя она? Военная монархия.
So I'm excited today to welcome Alexander Herbert to the show. We'll be discussing quite an interesting topic, so welcome, Alexander.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So today we're going to be looking at the Soviet Union from a different angle than we normally do so on this show. Historically, we've been focused on things like healthcare. The last episode we did was focused on sports, but music isn't something that we've typically touched on in this show, but that's what we're going to be doing today, specifically punk rock, which has its own stand-up political history in the Western world. So Alex has written quite extensively on this subject over the years and has made appearances on other podcasts and written numerous articles about the topic, which is all encapsulated in his book entitled What About Tomorrow? an oral history of Russian punks from the Soviet era to Pussy Riot. So Alex, what led you to write a book about punk rock in the Soviet Union?
First of all, thanks for having me on. I'm always happy and thrilled to come on podcasts and talk about this because I do think that my own sense of scholarship and understanding socialism is to try to relate it to things that are important to us today. And like music is one of those things. And so that was sort of the part behind this. When I decided to go to college, I was born in like a really, working class family, but then I decided to go to college and my family is of Polish background. And so I knew I wanted to study broadly Slavic things. I had no idea about Russia, but the school I went to, they had a study abroad program, which as any working class kid, I had to take out loans for and everything to do, but I still managed to do it. And I went to Russia to learn Russian. And I went to a smaller provincial city, Nizhny Novgorod, which is southeast of Moscow. The idea of like isolating myself within the language, away from English as much as I could. And while I was there, I had a few tattoos at the time. And while I was there studying the language, somebody recognized that I probably listened to punk rock. And so they were like, hey, do you want to come to a show? And, honestly, I was like, I didn't even know that you guys had punk rock here. I had no idea. So I did. I went to the show. It was like really sketchy process of leading me to like an abandoned factory where there was just an extension cord from the building next door leading into the factory, that everything was plugged into this one extension cord. The band that I saw there, their name is Party Breaker. They moved to Moscow later. But when they started, people just went nuts, crazy. Because I grew up in New England, in southern New England, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. So I went to punk shows in the Boston area and in Providence. And honestly, Boston has such a deep history of hardcore and punk that when you go to shows like that, most people are just kind of social standing. You know what I mean? They're not really expressing that much excitement, enthusiasm into it. What I saw there was really raw and exciting, and it seemed new. As an aspect of learning the language, I was kind of like, oh man, because at the time I was interested in Maximum Rock and Roll and Razor Cake and all of these other American zines, and I knew that they published interviews, and so I was like, man, I should interview these bands, and then as a way of practicing the language, I should translate the interviews and submit them to these Western zines, and so I just started accumulating interview after interview, and most of them, the vast majority of them, I didn't do anything with. I just had them, and they were stacking up. And so I started graduate school. I went to graduate school for Russian history, totally unrelated to punk rock, my academic research, but I still kept with this. So every time I went back to Russia, I did more interviews. I went to more shows and dug deeper into aspects of the scene until about 2017, I had almost 100 interviews, and I had no idea what to do with them all. It was actually my best friend who was like, you should put a book together. You have the interviews, do it. Why not? And, he pointed out that punk rock has this really rich tradition of oral histories, Please Kill Me, for example, where you tell the story through the actors themselves, just telling the stories. And I was like, that's sort of perfect. That's the most I could do because I am not a Russian punk. I didn't grow up in the Soviet Union. And so I didn't want to over-intellectualize or over-academize what I was passionate about in that way, in a personal sense. And so, I put the book together as something that is very much my best attempt at having these people speak for themselves and tell their own history.
Kind of to the point you made earlier, punk rock isn't what I associate with the Soviet Union. I became familiar with your work from Ray, who's a common friend of ours. Before that, I never made any kind of connection between the Soviet Union and punk rock. And is that something that carries over, in general, to, say, for example, Western or American punk rock? Is there kind of an international understanding of the genre, or is it just very nationally based?
Well, I think the internet has changed everything. At least I don't know right now, because after the Ukraine war and how that's kind of messed things up. Russian bands would always put their music on Bandcamp now, as of 2018 or whatever. When I initially went to Russia, it was 2011 or 2012, and the internet existed, but it wasn't nearly what it is today. And Bandcamp maybe it was around, but people weren't using it. And this was still kind of the waning years of the downloaded MP3 tracks from LimeWire and stuff like that. So I met plenty of Russian punks who were like, I have all of these albums from Western bands, American bands, from Boston bands, like Gangrene and stuff like that. But I had never met any American that knew Russian bands, let alone Soviet bands. And so it seemed very one way, right? That the rest of the world was looking at the West and the music that was coming from the West from a point of respect. But the Western world wasn't looking out at what effect it was having in the non-Western world.
Why was the Soviet Union guarded when it came to, say, for example, outside influences in general? That could be in music, it could be in philosophy, it could be in art, etc. What are your thoughts on this kind of Soviet guardedness over outside influences?
When I was putting the book together, I would say that, like, at that point, I was a socialist. I think always been a socialist, but I wasn't as theoretically conversed, and I wasn't as committed to communism as I would say that I am now. So I didn't really apply the same kind of skepticism and criticisms of what other academics and even punks from that time period were saying about the Soviet Union. I didn't really push them hard enough because a lot of them, some people were arrested in the Soviet period. And so their memory of that is, I freaking hate this country. I hated the Soviet Union because they arrested me. They put me in a mental hospital or they sent me to the military. That's their memory, their experience of it. And I didn't push them hard enough because I didn't really have an understanding yet of, why the Soviet Union had these certain kind of reservations about particularly Western styles of counterculture. But it didn't really matter for the sake of the research, because what I found is that in order to answer that question, you really have to be able to define what is punk rock. Is it a style, a genre of music that is a specific music style and the way that the instruments are played, yada, yada? Is it inherently political, right? Is there always a politics implied in punk, whether that's extreme left, extreme right, or, whatever the hell it is? So those are two questions that, for me, approaching the book, I had to kind of answer in order to, even start to entertain the question that you're asking now. Admittedly, in the book, I don't really come down on a definite answer because, again, I don't think it's my place to define what punk rock is or was to these people. But what I will say is that the way that it was transmitted, accepted, and adopted by people in the late Soviet Union in the late 1970s and into the 80s was a very uncouth, kind of dirty, careless youth counterculture. And so it wasn't necessarily political, but it was political in the sense that they purposefully understood the raggy clothes of Johnny Rotten and the kind of snotty, nasty sound as being against whatever mainstream society is, right? And you've got to think from the perspective of the Soviet Union and honestly the KGB, who at the time, after successive crises of the death of Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, and then, things changed with Gorbachev. But before Gorbachev, there is this sense of kind of cultural conservatism, of social conservatism, that any kind of youth pressure against the norms of social activity and social behavior is potentially subversive, and therefore we have to squish it out. Or if we can't squish it out, which they realize that they can't, we have to get some kind of control over it. And so what happens is in the early 80s in Leningrad, they create what's called the Leningrad Rock Club. It takes place in one of the houses of culture there. And you can imagine it as a big hall where what they did was they put established rock bands on the board of directors, essentially, for the Leningrad Rock Club. And so bands could go, amateur bands could go and they could apply to work at the Leningrad, to perform at the Leningrad Rock Club. And they had to provide their lyrics to this board of people. And they had to also, talk to the board so that the board could kind of vet them. And that's sort of the way that the establishment really understood their mechanism of trying to control the outbreak of what is this very counterculture movement. And, people I interviewed, they remember, you would go to the Leningrad Rock Club. Some people broke into the Leningrad Rock Club, and you could tell who in the crowd was a KGB agent. It was very obvious. They were older guys that were standing in the corner, not dressed in any kind of bohemian style, just dressed very normal. But they were there. They were just a part of it. And it was kind of accepted that in order to have this music institution, in order to play rock, even as amateur bands, these people have to be here. At the same time, there were bands that were not allowed to play in the Leningrad Rock Club. These were bands that were explicitly political in their lyrical content. So one example that I wrote about in the book is Автоматически удовлетворительный, which means Department of Self-Eradication or Self-Eradication Department. One of their songs that got picked up through a tape from a KGB agent, the lyric, I could swear here, right? It's all right. It's one of the lyrics says, Reagan and Andropov fucked all of Europe from behind. You know, the agents got a copy of the tape that had the lyrics in it. They called this individual into the KGB offices, a police station essentially, and they interrogated him. And they said, like, what's the deal with these lyrics, right? And they made him sign a contract that said that he wouldn't play music anymore in the Soviet Union. So there were exceptional cases in which somebody's politics, powers that be, had to come down really hard on it. Now, what I will say is, obviously, there's a disconnect between KGB agents who are tryhards, right, who are trying to prove that they're like cultural purists and doing what they're supposed to do, versus what the people at the very top of the Leningrad Communist Party or in Moscow really intended or wanted. I mean, that's some of the ways that some of the explanation that I would give. And I think, you know, because I think the other part of your question is asking me to reflect on my personal opinion on how this is.
It's a form of regulation of speech in some way, right? The way the Soviets approached not only music, but different kind of art forms, dance as well. So as a socialist, as a community communist, how do you reconcile this idea, which seems very antithetical, at least like at a plain observation, on the very least, it appears to be something that's very antithetical to socialist values of freedom?
And I think that that's a really fair question, because you kind of have to be a committed communist and socialist to really think about this stuff and why it is the way it is. Because on the surface, it just seems like the regime was, you know, mean and didn't like youth culture and stuff like that. But in reality, when you consider that these things are coming into the Soviet Union and East Germany, right? Everyone, I hope, has seen the image of the bands that the Stasi in East Germany identified as culturally offensive. There's like Pink Floyd is on there, AC/DC, Talking Heads, et cetera, et cetera. And there are reasons for that. So if you go back and, you know, suspend your judgment of those bands, your Western judgment of those bands, go back and listen to Talking Heads and listen to the song about, you know, there's that one song that they have about war. I forget what it's called, but it has the word war in it. And like, you'll hear why the Soviet Union would think that this is an anti-Soviet song, right? It talks about dropping bombs and stuff like that. Considering that it's only 10 years after all of this starts that the Soviet Union disappears, and it disappears for precisely mostly youth nationalism within the different republics, they were kind of right to suspect that this influx of Western culture was going to have a negative impact on the way that the youth understood what socialism is and what freedom is, what so-called freedom is, that what these bands were promoting in a way, even subliminally. Ace Frehley has no idea that he's promoting this stuff, but the way that it's understood in foreign audiences, it has that impact. And I think that those are like the subtle forms of propaganda that the West really does engage in. Whether or not it does that on purpose is another question, but there's definitely people in our cultural government that understand the role that this stuff has in kind of stoking popular nationalism and popular discontent against something like socialism.
So before we move on, I just want to make two quick points. The first of which is this guardedness over or regulation of music, media, art, etc., goes back to the revolution itself, right? Like, these aren't ideas that, and you can, of course, as an expert, correct me if I'm wrong here, this isn't far from what Lenin would have prescribed in terms of the regulation of these different forms, as these influences, as you mentioned, these outside influences are often used in very, very crafty ways by the capitalist powers. They're actively trying to dismantle the Soviet Union to encourage unrest, as you mentioned. I just found this recent article I guess not recent, 10 years ago, but 10 years ago, there's an expose on a US government program that infiltrated the Cuban hip hop scene to influence unrest among the youth. These are real things that do occur, that are occurring, and that have occurred. And as you mentioned, the Soviet Union didn't last very much long after this for a variety of reasons, but certainly one of the reasons was a maybe a rose-tinted perspective on the outside world, on the capitalist world system. At wow, if we move towards free market capitalism and get jeans, we can get 1,000 varieties of whatever. We can get cars that aren't the Trabant. You know what I mean? So yeah, no, it's a very interesting point of discussion in regards to Soviet regulation of media.
It's sad because it's one of those things that I think a lot of people in Eastern Europe today recognize now as a tragedy, which is what you said, the kind of rose-tinted idea of what the West was and the kind of like freedom of thought in quotation marks and movement that it promised versus like the costs that they had to pay for that, you know? So a lot like losing healthcare and pensions and all of those social welfare programs in exchange for being able to form punk bands and play at like small clubs. You know, is it really worth that trade-off? Like as you get older, maybe when you're young, you know, it's cool to play shows and travel around Ukraine or Poland or whatever. But when you get older and your pension is gone, then it's kind of not really worth it.
That's a great point. Kind of with that preliminary overview of the topic and of some kind of side points there, what were the early days of Soviet punk like? And could you give us some examples of maybe what some of the music focused on, who some of the main acts were?
There is a chapter about Siberian punk, which is its kind of own thing. But my book mostly focuses on punk in Western Russia, in Europe, in so-called European Russia. And in particular, like chapter 1 starts with Leningrad, because that to me is sort of the earliest manifestation of punk. And it's because geographically speaking, it's, you know, the Soviet Union's window to Europe, you know, classically Russia's window to Europe. But a lot of goods are coming from Europe through through Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and also radio transmissions can be picked up across the Baltic in Leningrad. So like Boomtown Rats are one of the first bands that some of these early Leningrad punk progenitors hear through BBC radio transmission. And of course, the Sex Pistols. And what it is in this early period, this is before the Leningrad Rock Club, is really just a group of kids that discover the Sex Pistols and other primarily British bands. One of them, the kind of leader of this motley crew, Svin, which means pig in Russian. His mother is a ballerina or a dancer, I think. And his father lives in Israel. And his father plays some kind of, you know, I don't know exactly what it is because nobody could really explain it to me, but some kind of role. And so people in school didn't really like Sven because they considered his father to be a traitor and thus him to be a traitor. So he's kind of an outcast, but he has this group of friends and he has expensive radio equipment because his dad was sending money through Israel to his family to help them. They had the money to buy like so-called the best stereo in Leningrad. So people would come to his house to listen to his records and stuff. And when they discover the Sex Pistols, the story goes that one of his friends was like, we can do this. Like, this is easy. Like, just get the instruments and we just play the music. And so they do. They start amateurly picking up the instruments and practicing them. And again, it's not about the music at this point. It's about the look, right? It's about being culturally transgressive. And so, you know, you can look up videos of the band Автоматически удовлетворительный or the Automatic Satisfiers. You can look up videos of them and you'll see like Sven dancing or like singing and then his like pants like casually drop or something like that. The idea was to shock, right? Just as what punk's all about at this time. And so they start playing and they start incorporating more people into their crew. These are also the same group of people who invent an entire film genre called necrorealism. And you can look up on YouTube some necrorealist films. It's the same guys, just experimenting with different art forms. But they get a whole crew around them. And then some of these people start getting actually really good at their instruments. So Victor Tsvoy, who a lot of people know, even if you don't know anything about Soviet rock, people know who Kino was, or Victor Tsvoy. So he's part of this group. Before he joins Kino, he plays guitar initially. He plays bass for the Automatic Satisfiers, and then goes on to form his own band, Kino, which becomes super famous.
What time period are we talking about here? What years?
This is the early to mid 80s, before Perestroika and Glasnost. Because when Perestroika and Glasnost come, it really changes everything. It kind of opens up the Leningrad Rock Club to more punk as a genre. And so newer bands like Object Nasmieshik join, Object of Ridicule is the translation, join the rock club. And what's really interesting about what I call this Perestroika punk, is that they're not against socialism or anything. In fact, they like perestroika. Most of their songs are in praise of the reforms as like, you know, socialism with a human face or whatever. But they're not anti-socialist in any sense. And so perestroika punk is kind of the final years of the Soviet Union. And again, it's all people that are operating mostly within the same city. Moscow doesn't really have much of a punk scene until the 90s. It has like so-called apartment shows where people would go and play like acoustic guitar for their friends, and some of those songs would be kind of punkish, folk punkish in style, but there's no like Leningrad Rock Club to the same extent as Leningrad has. Best way that I could say, the Siberian punk scene is a totally different case. There's probably more persecution and more politics in the Siberian punk scene, but also like the star of that, Yegor Letov, he kind of becomes a national Bolshevik when the Soviet Union collapses. And so like people like his band at the time, Grizhdanska Oborona, but like after his death, he kind of had a very sour taste for most Russians because of his so-called national Bolshevism.
Do you mean after the fall of the Soviet Union?
Yeah. After the fall of the Soviet Union, he helped create the National Bolshevik Party, which is National Socialism, but just, you know, under a hammer and sickle banner.
Damn, that sucks. For our audience that does know, National Socialism, it's the full name of Nazi.
Yeah.
Kind of already touched on this briefly, but I'd like to hear maybe some more specific examples from different parts of Soviet society. It's the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. Punk rock is becoming a thing. It's emerging. Of course, it's not some hugely popular thing. It's a emergent counterculture. So how did Soviet society in general respond to the emergence of this new form of counterculture music?
I think it's hard to say what Soviet society in general, how they responded to it, because it's such a like hyper-focused movement in Leningrad. And so you really only have Leningrad and Moscow to like go on and how they're responding to it. But there are pictures from the Leningrad Rock Club, and it's a big venue. You can imagine it like the size of a basketball stadium, and it's packed. It's packed from floor to the rafters in the top. So like clearly youth are driven to this stuff. They like to listen to rock music. They like to dress, you know, in their subversive ways, and they like to participate in feeling like they're a part of a community inside of a community. There's really no, I didn't get any like opinion of older Soviets, mostly because most of them have died. So like the people from the 80s who were in bands at the time that I interviewed, most of their parents are gone already. So it's hard to get like, okay, what about like the non-punk, the average non-rock enthusiast? What were they into? I didn't really get too much of that, just because it's kind of hard to do, because people who are of prominence now, they were all, at least in Leningrad, they were all for it. They all liked it, because you got to understand that just like bubblegum and blue jeans, like rock and roll was kind of the epitome of freedom, of a certain type of freedom that they were being sold unintentionally or intentionally. You know, it was hugely popular. At the same time, the group of musicians, the people who are actually in bands, is pretty small. You know, talking like maybe 30, 40 people in general who are like recycling in different bands and playing in different groups and sharing tapes among each other. But the crowds are huge, especially by the mid 80s and through Perestroika years.
You know, that's interesting. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. I think people now generally know that rock and roll in the United States was not well received as a genre in the fifth, I guess, depending on when you claim it started. Let's say, for example, you use the 50s as an example. Elvis Presley, of course, is coming to prominence. Rock and roll is being connected to some form of degeneracy, whether that's moral degeneracy, racial degeneracy, like whatever the hell that they were saying. How does that kind of anti-rock and roll cultural stance differ from, I guess, maybe Soviet responses to Soviet punk, or were they the same?
I think from like an institutional level, again, it was, you got to think it's not just Chernenko and Andropov who are old, right? It's It's the Leningrad party leadership who are also very old and socially conservative and who are also aspiring to a position in the Politburo in Moscow. There's all this sorts of kind of careerism in the Soviet Union that is unavoidable, whether you're a communist or socialist or what. You have to admit that was a real problem. But in any case, they are institutionally culturally conservative and worried about what effect the music is going to have on younger people. And it's not just music, too. I wrote a book on Soviet horror films. And there was also the sense that horror as a genre, it's a bourgeois genre, simply put, that it deals in the realm of metaphysics in the abstract and distracts people from concrete realities and sources of plight or danger or whatever it is. And it scares people unnecessarily. And so just culturally speaking, all of these things, punk rock, horror, yada, yada, I would say that party leadership is too conservative to really accept the fact that the youth are going to adopt it and adapt it no matter what, just by nature of how it's coming into the Soviet Union. Because not only is it transgressive, but it's coming from the West, right? And so anything coming from the West is cool, right? Just like in the 50s when you said anybody wearing a leather jacket and reciting beat poetry are fucking cool. You know what I mean? Even though, like, we learned later on that, like, actually some of those beat guys kind of sucked, like, big time. But you can't really see it at that time because it's new. And so there is this tension between, at least in Leningrad, I could say, between the youth and that culturally conservative party leadership. You said earlier, there's a whole bunch of reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed. Well, that's another one, right? Just this disconnect between the party unwilling to kind of culturally adapt itself to how the world was changing and how you couldn't just shove, civil society back into a conservative box once that Pandora's box was opened.
So you kind of given us an overview through the 80s up to Perestroika and through Perestroika of the Soviet punk scene, small, but had some impact in Leningrad and in Moscow. How did the collapse starting in, we'll say, 1990, 91, how did the Soviet collapse influence the punk rock scene through the tumult of the post-Soviet 90s?
Well, I mean, you could probably already guess, right? Because the fact is that the disappearance of the Soviet Union opened up a whole bunch of new potential markets for people within post-Soviet space. And one of them was music. What you got in the 90s was the proliferation of music venues, small music venues that, like, you and I are more accustomed to now. Underground, DIY venues, et cetera, that spring up in the 90s. Mostly established by people who had the money and the means to go to the West and see how CBGB operated or what it looked like, right? And they took that CBG model and just brought it to now St. Petersburg with them or Moscow with them. The issue is that because in the Soviet period, the political content of music was so limited and restricted, that meant that in the 90s, when the Soviet Union disappeared, you could, under this supposedly new liberal Russia, you could have political opinions. And that meant that throughout the 90s, you go to a show of this band that maybe you used to love in the 80s, and then all of a sudden they're singing a song about, Nazis and Nazism. And you're like, wait a minute, I didn't know that these guys were Nazis, right? And so it really, in the 90s, it polarizes the punk scene because bands start taking political positions. The 90s has A, the proliferation of these venues, B, the politicization of punk rock in a way that hadn't existed before. And then by necessity, there are bands who take definite anti-fascist positions against the emergence of these Nazi bands. And then D, you get commercial punk rock for the first time in Russia in the 90s. Bands like Tarakani, Korol y Shut, Clown and the Jester, and Tarakani is Cockroaches. But if you look it up, it's just spelled Tarakani. And Naive, who's a band from Moscow who actually releases their first album through Maximum Rock and Roll. These are, I call them the Moscow Giants because they're commercial bands that come from Moscow and really start to play like big venues and make money off of punk rock. And they, for the most part, don't take any political positions. It's the underground bands in this new underground where politics becomes a major concern because, like I said, maybe you went to the Leningrad Rock Club with, like your friends, like you and I went to the Leningrad Rock Club in the 80s to go check out some band. and now it's the 90s and we don't have to be socialists anymore. And so you decide I'm a national Bolshevik now, right? And I'm like, the fuck? Like, I didn't know you felt that way. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't know you.
Surprise.
Yeah, I didn't know you were like that. And so now if I'm still going to mess with you, then people are going to think that I'm a national Bolshevik. So now I don't want to go see your band. I don't want to go with you to a show anymore. So the bands who take these kind of nationalistic positions, they start losing out on fans. They become very angry and vindictive about it. And so in the late 90s, you get outright street wars between Nazis, literal Nazis, and, you know, people just trying to defend themselves or go home after a show. Not even necessarily anti-fascists, but just people who aren't as politically, you know, engaged in anything, don't have a nationalist stance in anything. Those are the ways that the music changed after 1990. The market comes and the fascism follows almost immediately. That's how it is.
I believe it. I feel like that's one thing that's not well understood in the West is what we'll say successful job the Soviet Union did in mitigating, suppressing fascism within its borders while it existed. Because at the collapse, crazy shit emerges after that, right? As you mentioned, people no longer had to like pretend, I guess, to be socialist when they were fascists themselves or whatever, right? I know I had Sopo Japaridze on the show a couple episodes ago to talk about Georgia, and she talked about how like people, of course, complained during the Soviet era that, about like censorship of books. We couldn't publish certain things. And then after the Soviet Union, it was just this like huge boom and just straight out racist Nazi pseudoscience, right? That became popular books.
Mein Kampf is published in Russian in the 90s for the first time.
Just for readers who are interested in just learning about Nazi Germany, no affinities there for some people for sure.
Yeah.
We end the 90s with just street wars, people leaving shows, not necessarily anti-fascists themselves, just being the targets of deranged Nazis and other fascists. So moving then from the late 90s, this very kind of polarized, violent at sometimes scene, what do we get into the 2000s and the 2010s? What does the afterlife of Soviet punk look like in modern day Russia?
I can't give you modern day, like post, Ukraine war, because I haven't been back there since. I was there when the war broke out, but I haven't been back since, and a lot has changed. But I do want to say before getting into that, to backtrack a little bit to what you were talking about with collapse and the conditions of collapse. I do want to say that the Soviet Union was really great at times at embracing expressions of national culture and just making these national cultures feel like they belonged in a union of states. But the conditions for like this emergence of fascism in the 90s, they are rooted in the 80s. And for liberal historians and a lot of liberals, it's very confusing, right? Because if you see the Soviet Union as the collapse of the Soviet Union as a good thing, right, then you'll look at what happened in the Baltic states, what happened in Ukraine or Uzbekistan in 1989, 1990, and 1991, you'll see it as a good thing, right? That these states finally declared their independence and left the Soviet Union. But behind that movement was a deep nationalist impetus and movement behind them. Even in Russia, if you go back and read Boris Yeltsin's platforms for presidential candidacy, it's all about Russian nationalism. It's all about re-seizing Russian natural resources and assets, saying, very similar to what Donald Trump says today, which is like, why should we Russians be giving our oil to, the Baltics, to Latvia or Ukrainians? Like, this is for Russia. So the roots of that fascism are in this moment, right in the beginning of the market kind of making its way into Russia. And I think that reality, for all of his good intentions, is something that Gorbachev really couldn't foresee and didn't know how bad it would get. That fascism that emerges in the music scene on a more like micro level is less surprising, considering that everybody, even Westerners, seem to think that this was like quote unquote good nationalism, In the early 2000s, as I said, the 90s is all about kind of Russian punk finding its place. By the early 2000s, there's more exposure to Western bands. There's more experience in the West. People go to Germany or, Poland or France, where there's kind of a little bit older scenes that they can see how it works and how it runs, how it operates. And certain subsets of the subculture start to make their way into Russia, like straight edge, for example. It comes into Russia at the time. And one of those subsets is anti-fascism, not just as a political position, but as a movement. So like the anti-fascist skinhead movement in the early 2000s in Russia is huge, because what these anti-fascist skinheads were about was self-defense. And so they had these hardcore bands that they would, play in abandoned bomb shelters or stuff like that. And they would, impose the buddy system. If you're going back to the metro, make sure you have friends with you, because there are neo-Nazis that are waiting around to jump you. Or, if you come to the show and you don't have a weapon for self-defense, here's a bag of like bats and sticks. Take them with you as you leave. And so they create these movements for self-defense as this like anti-fascist reaction to the emergence of neo-Nazism that really, really reaches its height in the early 2000s. The street battles get particularly bad. There's a great novella by a friend of mine. I translated it into English. It's called Exodus. It's translated. It's in Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, German, French, all of those languages. It's really small. It's about 70 pages. And he was the lead singer of a band. The band's name is Straight Edge. Pravolenchaya Linyenka is the name. And he was kind of the leader of the Moscow anti-fascist crew. And he was telling me, as I interviewed him a few times, he was telling me that like sometimes they would book shows in Kursk, tiny city, where, there's no more than like 30 punks there, maybe. They would make a flyer for it and advertise it all around. This is the early days of social media. They advertise it on MySpace, Counterculture, or whatever, knowing that neo-Nazis would see the flyer and then go to the show. And he was like, sometimes we wouldn't even really book the show. We just made it up just to get these guys to come out, just to get into fights with them when they got into the street. And so there are a lot of people in the early 2000s who die, who get stabbed, they get shot on both sides. That leads eventually the Russian government to brand both fascists, both the Nazis and the anti-fascist movement, as extremist movements under the Center for Combating Extremism of the Russian Federation. And so that it sort of calms things down. But, when I was there in the height of my research, like in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, I didn't really run into Nazis at any show that I went to by then. It's 2014, 15, and 16. I didn't run into Nazis really ever, but I heard all of the stories about it. The only place that I did run into Nazis, and this was more recently, is not this summer, the summer before. I went to Tbilisi, Georgia to film a documentary film. You can find it on YouTube. It's about Russian punks in Georgia, called Nothing Lasts Forever, Russian Punks in Georgia. It's a documentary film. But while I was interviewing one of the punks there in this abandoned old Soviet recreational park, there was like a group of Nazis that walked behind me. They were younger, like 17, 18. They asked us if we wanted to go beat up a pedophile in the park, and we were like, nah, we're cool. We just want to do this interview. It was very, very strange. And it's doubly strange when you try to tell people, particularly Americans who are like, gung-ho in support of Ukraine and refuse to believe that there are Nazis in a place like Ukraine. When you tell them that, like, no, I saw plenty of Nazis in Georgia, of all places. And this is a non-white country. Like, Georgians are not European Caucasian, you know what I mean? They are their own ethnicity. And it's just really strange to see white power skinheads in Tbilisi, of all places. But they exist and they're real. And so, when the Russian government says we're fighting Nazis, it's not totally lying. It maybe is stretching the truth to make it seem like there's more than there actually are, but they are definitely there. No doubt about it.
Are there any punk rockers from the Soviet era who are still who still have a functioning band or are still creating new stuff, or have they all kind of ended their careers?
The Ukraine war has really changed things because, like I said, I was in St. Petersburg when it broke out. I had friends that were on vacation in Georgia at the time that once the war broke out, they were like, fuck this, we're not coming home. We're going to stay in Georgia. Why would we come home? And so them, as well as some other friends who then left Russia, particularly like around the mobilization order a few months later, they moved mostly to Georgia, and they helped create new venues and restaurants, and they kind of like picked up the scene in St. Petersburg and just moved it to Georgia, which has its own problems, right? And this is what the documentary film tries to get at, is talking about punk as a gentrifying movement, really. But that's sort of the afterlife. There are still people in like St. Petersburg and Moscow, right? They don't have the money, the means, or really the desire to leave. They don't really face the threat of mobilization, maybe because they wear glasses or something like that. But a lot of people have kind of lost contact with some of them. Like I haven't talked to some friends in St. Petersburg who are still there for a while. Some of them, you got to also think, like, my main social media is Instagram. And so Instagram, you can't use it in Russia, but there are smart people who can get around it with the what is it, VPN. I still talk to them, but I never log on to like my Contactia page anymore because most of my real solid old friends have left. They're in Kazakhstan or Georgia or, in Germany or something. But it's still there. There's still punk music there. One band that is in St. Petersburg that I recommend everyone look up, they're called Ankulim or Ankulim. Let's see if I can, I forget what the anglicized spelling is. Let me see if I can find it. I'll have to send it to you.
Yeah, for sure.
But they're like a punk, metal, and Russian folk band. So they have like accordion and like, the like kind of screaming punk vocals and fast music and stuff like that. And they're still kicking it. And I know that the frontman of that band, he books a lot of shows. And so like since the war started, a lot of the DIY venues have been raided by the authorities. But they just pick up and they start another one somewhere else. It doesn't really faze them. And the authorities aren't bringing them to jail or anything. They're just kind of, these venues will pop up in like abandoned auto repair shops. And so the authorities will come and say like, you can't do this anymore. This is somebody else's property. Like, get out. You're squatting. And so they just say, all right, they go somewhere else. So it's not like, yes, there is like repression, but nobody's being arrested for it that I know of anyway.
So then maybe to end our discussion, was there any kind of final point that you wanted to make or impress upon us or on the listeners as to, I guess, maybe the importance of Soviet punk rock or like kind of its place in understanding the Soviet Union, for example, or socialism in general?
Yeah, I think hopefully what I tried to convey in talking about punk rock in like conservative culture and the older, members of the party is the complications that came with late socialism, very late socialism, that it's not just Gorbachev equals bad or like Soviet Union equals good. That like, yes, there are pluses and minuses in both cases, but it's very, very complicated. And, and like your podcast is about actually existing socialism is like, for me, the idea that people live complex lives on multiple scales, right? You exist in a union, you exist in a national formation, a nationality, you exist in a city. In that city, you exist in a region in the city. In that region of the city, you exist in a neighborhood. In that neighborhood, you have, friends, and they have friends that exist in different neighborhoods, in different nationalities, and so like the chains of connectivity within the Soviet Union is so complex that to put any kind of like overarching, this is what we should think of the Soviet Union, is almost impossible to think about it that way. And that, because I also do this project, Lenin in 45 volumes, where like you can see behind me on the side, there's like, I have all 45 volumes of Lenin's work in English. And like people think that I'm obsessed with Lenin and like, some big Leninists. And like, yeah, I think Lenin was the coolest revolutionary in the world. But at the same time, as a historian, like I know that he existed at a specific time and place and that his ideas weren't this kind of like static thing and that they changed in response to circumstances around him and people around him. My point with this book, with even the horror book and with Lenin in 45 volumes and the movie, all this stuff is to just show people that socialism is very complicated. It's not a static thing. And it does kind of respond to, a good dialectician, material dialectician, responds to what's going on around them and understands it within the dialectic process of some kind of historical movement. And that within that process are people living complicated lives.
Well, then on that note, Alex, I just want to say thank you for joining the show today, for really walking the listeners through a period we haven't really talked much about this show. We haven't talked about the 70s or in the 80s apart from the collapse, right? If we talk about the 80s, we're talking about the collapse. But to learn about this fragment or this part of the Soviet culture and how it was shaped by the collapse and by modern day impacts was really interesting. And I appreciate you taking the time for this.
I would love to talk more specifically about, the 80s in general in the Soviet Union. I've also published an academic article on an environmental movement in provincial Russia in the late 80s. So all these forms of counterculture that emerge, alternative politics that emerge, it's all part of what I'm saying about the complexity of this period. That, again, I don't want people to just be like Gorbachev equals bad, but there's some truth, there's some not truth to that. So it's very complicated. So thanks for having me on and letting me nerd out about Russian punk for a little bit.
Yeah, no problem. I look forward to having you on the show again.
Cool, thanks.